I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co., and this is 10 board games that are worth the hassle. And what does hassle mean exactly? What do I mean by worth the hassle? For the purpose of this video, for the purpose of this list, hassle to me refers to things that get in the way of playing the game. And yes, that encompasses a bunch of things, and no, I'm not counting kids or jobs or any of things like that, but things specific to the game itself. And specifically, the 4 areas that I'm having in mind as I go through this are the rules of the game, which includes both you learning the game as well as teaching others. For me, honestly, teaching others I find is the biggest challenge, because I can get past a bad rulebook eventually, or a long rulebook. Actually, I can get past a long rulebook eventually. The problem is I then have to teach the game to the group, and then if another player is showing up, I have to teach it again, and if someone else shows up, I have to teach it again. And so very often games that have long teaches, those can get in the way of the game. The length of the game is another factor. How long is the actual experience that you are playing? Setup is going to be a third aspect, literally just how much time do you need to spend setting up the game, and then the fiddliness of the game experience itself. And fiddliness and setup I do find are often intertwined. The more components you have, the more fiddliness, but not necessarily always an exclusivity. But nonetheless, those 4 things: rules, length, setup, and fiddliness. Or you could divide rules into learning, teaching, length, setup, and fiddliness, those 5 factors. And no, there's not a scientific list of it's grades on a 4 and a 5 of here, 10 of this. It's just going in, those are the general things that I have in mind when I say the hassle involved in a game. And this video is 10 games worth the hassle. I picked the 10 games that I own, that I enjoy, that I make time to table, that are, in my opinion, some of the worst offenders of those 4 or 5 things combined. Also, this is part 1 of 2. There will be a second video at some point in the indeterminate future of 10 games that weren't worth the hassle. Those are not bad games, to be clear. Those are going to be 10 games that I decided not to keep, decided not to hold on to, despite thinking they were excellent, but the hassle was just a drop too much for me. And so with that in mind, let's go ahead and start off with number 10. And these are not ranked in order of my favorite or least favorite games. These are ranked in order what I think is the least hassle all the way up to the most hassle. Again, hassle including those 4 or 5 criteria. I'm going to start with number 10, which is an interesting one. I debated whether it makes this list, but I think it does for me, and that is Food Chain Magnate. Food Chain Magnate, with the expansion box over here, to me, the actual rules themselves are very short. I do find teaching the game is still a lot of time, though. You have to teach people about the process of the game, and then walk them through how things are going to play out, and you also have to guide them through strategies if you want them to have an optimal experience. And then, part of why it's on this list is, to me, Food Chain Magnate is not a game that I play without having at least a learning game for new players. This is a game that the game itself can be a 3 to 4 hour experience. 3 hours if you're moving quickly, 4 hours at 4 players. It can certainly take its time to go through it, and you could have a 2 hour long 3-player game if you really try and they all know the game well. But it's certainly not a small game, but it's also not the longest. But if you are someone who's new to the game, I will not play a full game with you. We will play an intro learning game, which will still take an hour to an hour and a half, just so you can understand all the things that you do wrong before trapping yourself into a 3 hour long experience that you will also have the worst score at the table, because oh my gosh, this game can be overwhelming in terms of how cutthroat it is despite not appearing to be so. The setup itself is not super fiddly. I do find the card organization, this whole stacks of cards you have to put out, it's not the smallest, but it's not the worst. The main reason this is here for me is the fact that this is a game that's heavy, it's a lot to teach, and you have to play a partial game just to get people onboarded. I think in general it's not the best. Like, you could obviously pivot if mid-game that player is doing really well. You can certainly pivot, but I do not plan around a full game. I plan around a partial game, and so far it has always been that way for me with new players, because they will inevitably make mistakes. They will inevitably look at their first few turns and go, oh my gosh, I would play things so differently if I understood now what was happening. That is Food Chain Magnate. But yes, the entire point of this list is it's absolutely worth all of that. That's my number 10. My number 9 is another Euro game, and I do find there's a good mix of different genres on the table over here. The number 9 is Unconcious Mind. Unconcious Mind is not a super heavy game. It's heavy, don't get me wrong, but it's not super heavy. I'd put it on the, maybe on the lower end of heavy as opposed to the higher end of medium, somewhere in that. But there's a lot going on as far as the weight of the gameplay itself. The tricky part here is the setup is a lot. The components, there's a lot of components to manage, a lot of setup going on over here. The rules themselves are decently long, but the teach I find is often longer, and then the length of the game often comes in at 3 hours plus, and there's a lot of modular stuff as well going on, so there's a variety of expansions you can include and incorporate, and yet I have no problem coming back to this. Again, the whole point, I mean, I'll say that about every one of these, the whole point is these games are worth the hassle. But Unconcious Mind, again, it's not the easiest game to table or set up. It is a game that I am partial to not teaching it to a new player. If I know that my regular core game group knows the game, and there's someone else new in the mix, I have to debate whether they are going to be a regular, and whether that's worth teaching them this longer experience that honestly you get the most out of on your second or third play and not your first play of the game. But nonetheless, the intricacies of the game experience are so incredibly satisfying as far as how the game goes that it's one of those games I'm always looking for an opportunity to table, and I'm always happy to continue to try out the various new content of the game, because there's a lot of ways to mix and match modules, and some of them are less so for me, some of them are a bit of a mix, and some of them I just wouldn't play the game without, sometimes even with new players, although I'm not certain about that. There's a lot going on in the game, like I said already, so I do have to be mindful of that. But that's our number 9. Our number 8 is a game that I wonder how often I will play this in real life. Meaning, this game, well, let's go ahead and show it to you. A Feast for Odin over here from Uwe Rosenberg. This is Component Madness. And this is also on Board Game Arena. And they even added the expansion on Board Game Arena, and until now, the fact that I could only get the expansion in the physical game was one of my main arguments to actually having and playing the physical game. Hey, if I want to play the New Regions expansion, I have to have the actual game, and I have to play it. And don't get me wrong, this is not going anywhere, no matter how often I actually table this, although I guess that is an interesting conversation itself. Can I put it on the list and say it's worth the hassle if I'm like, I'll always play it on BGA? And the first answer, the easy answer I'll give is yes, because if it wasn't on BGA, I would absolutely play it in real life. Like I said already, with the expansions, with the Regions expansion, that was previously the only way I would get it tabled. And I'm still not even averse to playing it in real life. There's something fun about the components, something fun about playing tactile experiences, but A Feast for Odin, the main issue you have here is there's something like 67 worker placement spots in the game. It might only be 45, I don't know. There's a whole board full of worker placement spots, and you kind of have to go through enough of them. You don't have to teach every single last one, but you have to go through enough of them that players can then infer from the rest of them, which is a lot. The rules itself, I don't find super complicated, but there's a lot of intricacies in terms of the strategy, but again, teaching players for the first time, that's going to be part of it. The other part is just the setup. There's a lot of components to manage, there's a lot of teach to manage, and it's a long experience to boot. There's a lot going on here that get in the way of enjoying and experiencing A Feast for Odin, but when you actually table it, it is so ridiculously satisfying. It is one of the best Euro games I have. It is one of the best games I have on these top 10 over here, these 10 games I have. It's one of the best ones I have. It's an incredible experience that's well worth the hassle, and the good news is you could play it on Board Game Arena if you want to skip that hassle. I don't know if it's a good first experience. I know for me, I've enjoyed playing it as a subsequent experience, but I do find that some games on BGA, on Board Game Arena, sometimes they're not good for the first experience, and sometimes they're not good at all. This is definitely not in the second category, but the first experience I just don't know, because my first experience, my first several games of this were playing it in person before finally tabling it on Board Game Arena. I should also note, by the way, that other games I considered putting in this spot are Glass Road, lots of fiddly components, a little easier as far as how the teaching the game goes, and then Caverna as well. Caverna has a lot of bits and bobs to go through, and a lot to teach about all the various intricacies, so those are both games I considered putting here. There's some degree of when a game is similar enough or fitting into a similar category. I did pick the one that is most representative, and that's, for me, A Feast for Odin. Coming in at number 7, we have our first, from 3 Euros over here, we have our first non-Euro, and that's going to be Stalker, the board game. Stalker, the board game from Awakened Realms, has a lot to it, and there's a reason why it's over here. Arguably, it should be even lower down on the list, and I'll explain, meaning lower down, meaning it's even more convoluted and more work, but there's a reason it's over here coming in only at number 7, and we'll walk you through that. The first problem is the rules are long. There is a whole intro stuff to go through. You don't have to know everything right away, but it certainly is a long rule book, and you could reference while you play, but that still means you're kind of pausing your experience to get into it. And the game itself is not super long. Individual sessions can vary. I'd say typically in the 90 to 2 hours range, so it's not that it's super long. The setup itself is a little fiddly, but again, not super fiddly. I don't find the setup to be the worst part. The main thing getting in the way of Stalker is the rules video. There was actually just recently a rules video on the channel that went up for Stalker, how to play by easy board games, and it's an hour long. long for the how to play. There's a lot of information to cover if you want to know how to play Stalker. The reason it's over here is because, frankly, as far as the teach part is not nearly as bad. If you know how to play Stalker, you can get people up and running in maybe 15 minutes. It's not nearly as bad. Yes, you'll have to run and manage all the various things, and they can pick that up slowly as you go through the experience, but I do find that the main thing in the way is you understanding the rules. You have to figure out how to play, you have to learn, you have to either like pick it all up at once, or alternatively sit down and play your first game solo before incorporating other players. But once you do so, the teach itself and managing the game is significantly easier, which is why it's only at number 7 and not lower down on this list. Coming in at number 6, we have another Euro game. We have Sankore, The Pride of Mansa Musa. I think it's called Pride of Mansa Musa. Sankore is an excellent experience. The fiddliness is a little bit there. There's lots of components to manage. The setup is a bit of a process to go through, but realistically, the main thing that's in the way here is the teach. Again, not even learning the game, because for me, learning the game is something you get past. It is a barrier, but once you've gotten past that barrier, it's less of a barrier. It still can be a barrier if you come back to a game you haven't played in 2 years. There's certainly a degree of refreshing that has to go on, but for me, ultimately, Sankore is, well, of course it's worth it. It's why it's on this list over here. But Sankore is definitely one that has a lot of rules overhead. This is one of those games where it all comes together beautifully as you start taking your turns. You can appreciate your first game. You don't need to get to game 2 or 3. You can appreciate your first game, and it's oh so good. It is absolutely worth it, but it is one that has like almost an hour of rules. Like even once you get your act together, even once you know what you're doing, I'd say a fast, really streamlined teach is going to be 30 minutes on the low end, and I don't even know if that's possible. There's a lot of interactions you have to be aware of, a lot of things as far as how everything works together in the game, and none of it do I find to be immediately intuitive. It is not an intuitive experience as far as how the scoring works, as far as how the kind of area majority areas work, as far as the fact that areas flow into the side area after you score, so there's kind of residual after effect of what wasn't claimed that you still have to be mindful of. Even saying this sounds confusing. The game is confusing, but I do find that it's an excellent experience. It's my top 100. In fact, most of these games have been in my top 100. Not all of them. Most of the games have been in my top 100 games, at least as of 2024. But Sankore is high up there. It's an incredible experience. One of my favorite Euro games in my collection. Coming in at number 5, we have a hard one, and this is going to be from Chip Theory Games, and this is Cloudspire, brought to you with the smaller box so that I don't break my table with all the games on it. But Cloudspire is a lot. Again, worth it, it's still here for a reason, but Cloudspire is one that has a lot to actually get to and learn, and the tricky part is I don't even think the game is that complicated. I don't know what it is about the experience. I do find it is hard to learn and hard to pick up. It doesn't help that there's rules for competitive, for solo, and for co-op to manage. There's different scenario guides, there's a ton of content, and I should note, by the way, one thing I didn't talk about over here is when I'm taking into account this list, I was not including expansions that made the game worse. Meaning, if there's a game that is harder to table and what's the word I used? The hassle worth the hassle. If the hassle was only caused by getting additional content, I did not include it on this list. Games like Vindication, Marvel Zombies, Everdell, things that have like these big boxes and expansions and all of that makes it unwieldy, I did not hold that against the games. I'm going by base games only over here. But for Cloudspire, despite holding the expansion box, the base game only is still a lot to go ahead and manage. It's a lot to teach. It's a lot to learn. Even if you're doing it cooperatively, you still have to teach a lot to the other player, and frankly, it's a lot as far as just managing the setup, the game time, all of it is kind of in the way. It's an experience that I love, but it certainly is to me, it's one of Chip Theory's more convoluted experiences to learn, and again, I feel that could be better. I don't know what it is about the experience, I just find that it is one of their harder games to learn as far as how it all comes together. But still worth it. Coming in at number 4, we have another small box over here, but that's going to be Primal the Awakening, meaning this is... I think the cards are loose in here. This is the smaller box for Primal. Primal obviously has a much bigger box, but Primal, even just the core, because the core box is like this big over here, is a gigantic experience, but it is a lot. Primal has a rule book that is 120 pages long. Don't get scared, it's not actually 120 pages, it just happens to be 120 pages, but realistically it's like 30 pages of learning the game, and then another 20 pages or so of learning the campaign, and then in that rule book you have everything else baked into there. They have player guides and scenario scenarios and monsters. They have all this stuff into the rulebook that makes it a longer rulebook than it actually is. It is significantly easier to pick up and play. The first 30 pages are all you need to start Primal. But despite that, if you want to play through Primal, you do have to learn more. You do have to pick up all those things. You have to know the monster intricacies. You have to know the details, the differences. You have to go ahead and manage all the cards. You want to talk fiddly. The game experience is not super long. You could have a game of Primal in 90 minutes. You could have it in 60 minutes if you're really fast. I'd say typically you're looking at that 90 to 2 hours, a more common frame. But ultimately, Primal is an excellent experience, but there's a lot in the way. Length is not bad, but setup is a lot. Fiddliness is a lot. Crafting your decks is a lot. Managing the campaign aspect is a lot. There's a lot that is a lot when it comes to Primal, all the way starting with rules and going through the rest of it. The only one of the notes that it doesn't hit, honestly, is the length. Length, I mean, at 90 to an hour and 20 is not the worst at all, but again, it's excellent and worth all of that. I gotta stop saying that. That's gonna be true for everything on this list. That's the whole point of this list. Anyways, moving on to there, we have my number 3. Number 3 is another one that I play primarily digitally, but I still play it on the tabletop, and that is Through the Ages, A New Story of Civilization. And once again, I still play on the tabletop, and more importantly, if I couldn't play it digitally, I would play it more often on the tabletop. Through the Ages from Vlaada Chvátil strikes a few of the boxes. It is not the hardest game to, well, it is a hard game to learn. It's a hard game to learn. There's a lot going on. The game actually breaks up your learning into several ways to play the game, adding different elements. You can play through several experiences, slowly adding more mechanics and ages to the game to not overburden you. But I don't actually think it's super complicated to learn. There's a lot to make it easier. I don't think it's the hardest game to learn, especially if you're willing to have a learn as you play experience where players are more forgiving and perhaps you don't initiate as many wars against that new player at your table. But it is certainly long. This is a game that one time I was up till 4 in the morning and we had to call the city to make sure that cars weren't towed for a game night. It's a little insane how long the experience can go. Granted, we did start at 10 p.m. for a 4-player game. I don't think I'm ever interested in doing a 4-player game of Through the Ages again. It's just too long. But when you come in at 3 players I generally find is closer to that 4-hour range. Still long, make no mistake, but that's a much more manageable length of time. But the fiddliness is a big part of it. Managing all your tokens in this game is a lot. It's one of the reasons why people strive to go for the app that takes care of all of that math and all of that homework for you. It's why there are so many excellent digital adaptations of Through the Ages, and yet this still is an excellent experience. So for me, well, again, obviously on the list over here, Through the Ages, Vlaada Chvátil, CGE, has its several versions. You can play it digitally. I think playing it digitally is totally fine. I do think that having the physical game is worth it because of how good of an experience it is. That is Through the Ages, A New Story of Civilization. Coming in next, and we're now up to number 2, we have another one that's going to be a twofer over here. We're counting 2 games in the place of 1, and that is, oh boy, I'm realizing now the difficulty of trying to get this over here, because it's a heavy box. This is the Elder Scrolls Betrayal of the Second Era. Probably should have just gone with the lid over here. And I'm counting too many bones in this, although I will say as far as the ranking on the list, this got a higher ranking based on the Elder Scrolls. You see, there's a lot going on in Elder Scrolls. There's a big teach over here. There's a lot to learn as far as playing the experience. Teaching the experience, like once you know it well, running the experience is significantly easier. Like Stalker before it, if you know how to play the game, the other players don't have to know nearly as much. If you know all the interactions, what will happen, how different things work as you go into different types of encounters, as you wander around the board, as you walk into a village, as you go on a delve, as you go into a combat encounter, if you can run the game, the other players need to know so much less. And so that part, it shares with Stalker. You don't need to know an absolute ton of it. The question there is, why is it not higher on this list? Why is it coming in at number 2? And that's because the length of the game is something that gets in the way of the experience. This is a game that plays across 3 arcs, but each individual arc, I still haven't gotten an arc below 5 hours yet. I shouldn't say that. I think I haven't gotten an arc. I haven't timed every arc. I know that first one I know for sure was in the 7-hour range. It did get lower than that as you played. Maybe 4 hours, maybe, but like, it is a long experience, especially because at least for myself, I'm still at a place where I have to reference rules here and there. It's not infrequent for me to have to go and check, well, how does that play out? Oh, we're on a new zone over here. So there's a lot to manage as you play through the Elder Scrolls. So the game length is high. The learning is incredibly hard. Learning is harder than Stalker, in my opinion. If you want to learn the game yourself, you want to know how everything works, it is more time than Stalker. The teach, again, once you're teaching it to other players and running the experience, it's not as bad. That's more akin with Stalker. But outside of that, the setup setup, I don't think the setup is bad. Setup's actually not hard at all. Setup is even easier than Stalker, but I'm just comparing it to Stalker a lot because of that teach and learn disparity. But the fiddliness of the length of it is the biggest reason why it's coming in at number 2. But this is not the number 1 hardest game as far as measuring direct hassle, and honestly, I think we'll keep it here. My number 1 over here is going to be Arena the Contest / Tenaris Adventures. That's going to be my number 1 as far as not ranking the games, but as far as the most hassle of an experience. Because this is a lot. And I'm specifically counting Tenaris Adventures as the one that is more hassle. I honestly think Arena is a little easier to pick up and table and manage. Tenaris is worse because of several things. First of all, from the campaign nature, but also the rulebook was so much worse. It is one of the worst rulebooks I have read, as far as I walked in knowing mostly how to play, and it was still a giant hurdle to actually go ahead and learn everything. It's a good thing I already knew that I loved the game before I dove into Tenaris Adventures, because I don't know if I'd power through that otherwise. But the experience itself, the rules, again, it's going to share a little bit of DNA with Elder Scrolls and Stalker, in the sense that running the game for other players will be significantly easier. If you're the one who has to know everything, the learn will be very hard. The teach, not super hard. I don't think the teach is the worst. I think that part's pretty streamlined. If you've played any kind of dungeon crawler, things will be familiar. Yes, there'll be differences, exceptions, things you have to know, but if somebody else is running it, it is not nearly as bad. The setup, not the worst either. Honestly, the setup's not bad at all. The fiddliness, not that bad, but the length is also a big factor. This is another one that comes in. Honestly, I don't know. I think this beat out Elder Scrolls because the rulebook was just so much worse. The length is not as bad, but then also it does have the factor that if you're playing through the campaign, you have to manage and track your campaign as you go, which does add an extra degree of fiddliness and maintenance to the experience. But ultimately, Tenaris Adventures is an excellent experience. It's one that is still worth it. There's a reason it's still here. There's a reason I've gone through so much of the campaign and still plan on finishing through more of it, because it's an incredibly satisfying experience as far as managing the tactical aspect of the gameplay on your table. And that's my list over here. These are my 10 games that are worth the hassle. All of these games are a lot. They're all definitely something that I would warn people as far as the downsides before you sit down and table them, or worse, go out and buy them. I want you to know what you're getting yourself into, but for me, they're all worth the hassle. Let me know in the comments down below a game or two that you feel is definitely a lot, but for you is still worth that experience. And make sure to keep your eyes tuned for when the follow-up to this video shows up, probably in a week or two, but we'll see, of the 10 games for me that are excellent experiences, but for me, they were not worth the hassle. In any case, and until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, I hope you have a good one.